Ever since humans first looked up at the stars, we've dreamed of reaching them.
It was this extraordinary frontier of the human spirit and human exploration.
When humans finally traveled to the moon, that dream became a reality.
It's one small step for man.
Or did it?
I have physical evidence, 100% proof, they really didn't go to the moon. Until these people are caught, they will keep stealing truth from the public.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
On Conspiracy, we ask, were the moon landings the most elaborate hoax in human history?
Those photographs, they weren't taken on the moon, they were taken here on Earth.
Plus, was there a secret Soviet conspiracy to hide the deaths of cosmonauts in space?
People began to suspect that Moscow would say anything and lie about anything if it came to their space program.
And are humans traveling the solar system using alien technology?
It was a very exotic craft, so it didn't look man-made at all.
There's been a base on Mars for the last 20 years, and there's people can go and stay there for years on end.
In the early 1960s, the United States and its bitter enemy, the Soviet Union, were locked in a battle for world supremacy.
During the Cold War, there is, in effect, a war going on, but it's a war without battles. It's a war of two completely different systems trying to score points off each other. And one of the ways of doing this is by going into space.
For the USA, being first to send men into space was not just about political one-upmanship, it was driven by fear. Americans believed Soviet rockets would rain down nuclear weapons from orbit, and that every US citizen was under threat. They had to win the space race at all costs. So in 1961, President Kennedy made a daring bid for victory.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon 8 years later, it made world history.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
As a young man, Marcus Allen was one of the estimated 600 million people who watched the landing live on TV.
It's fantastic. I've been following it. I thought it was an incredible achievement. Absolutely amazing. They'd landed men on the moon, and we saw it on television. How wonderful is that?
But in later years, Marcus started to become more skeptical. He now believes that iconic moment was actually a fake.
I started questioning whether what I was looking at had actually been taken on the moon. And they weren't.
Neil, this is Houston. That's a first.
He is one of many people who think the moon landings were the most elaborate conspiracy in human history.
Yeah, I noticed that. That's the...
Another of this theory's most vocal supporters is self-styled filmmaker Bart Sibrel.
My specialty is whether we went to the moon or not, and I have physical evidence, 100% proof that we did not.
Sibrel has spent decades and hundreds of thousands of pounds trying to prove that Armstrong's one small step was not on the moon at all, but in a TV studio here on Earth.
Why don't you swear in the Bible that you walked on the moon?
It doesn't, sir.
He's even called the moon astronauts liars
We just paid. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
to their faces.
until these people are caught. They were going to keep doing it and keep stealing truth from the public.
Why do so many people claim America told such an enormous lie? And how do they think the US managed to pull it off? Conspiracists say it all started in 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Former NASA mission controller James Oberg was 13 at the time, and he remembers it vividly.
The American national reaction to Sputnik was sheer terror. Suddenly we now had a Russian rocket, not just flying from Russia to the US, but circling the world and flying over the US 4 or 5 times a day.
America was shocked by this defeat, but 4 years later, it was utterly humiliated when a Russian cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, became the first man in space. President Kennedy was desperate to find something that would redress the balance. Historian Gerard de Groot has spent his career researching the space race.
Kennedy is really on the rocks, and he talks to his cabinet, and he says, look, we need to do something to get ahead of the Soviets. And it's interesting that it's not about discovery, it's not about science, it's about getting ahead. It's about a race. And the only thing they can think of is to come up with a goal that is sufficiently far away and sufficiently complicated that it will give the Americans time to catch up. And that goal is the moon.
It was a huge gamble. At that point, America's space agency, NASA, couldn't even get men into Earth orbit, let alone reach the moon. They had more than 20 spectacular failures before finally building a rocket that just barely worked.
They had first idea how to do it. Absolutely no idea at all. They had a rocket that could take Alan Shepard up. They could launch him. It was about 100-odd miles up and straight back down again.
NASA's rocket science was far behind its Soviet rivals. However, there was one thing the agency did better than anybody: public relations.
What is interesting is to look at just how much money of the NASA budget was spent on creating a good impression. So that's not the same thing as lying, but it is perhaps they were very good at spin. The astronauts themselves, for instance, were all presented as wonderful, perfect American heroes. And yet a lot of them got up to all sorts of things.
Many believe that NASA's spin machine was so sophisticated, it could easily fake an entire moon mission. Bart Sibrel says that's exactly what they planned to do, except one rogue astronaut wouldn't agree to the idea.
He was killed because he would not cooperate in faking the moon missions.
We choose to go to the moon.
In 1961, US President John F. Kennedy took an enormous risk by declaring America would land on the moon before the end of the decade.
When Kennedy made the commitment, the people I've talked to who were in the NASA program just knocked their socks off. They could not believe that the president could promise something like that and carry it out within 8 or 9 years.
By 1967, with just 3 years left to meet the deadline, NASA was still nowhere near achieving their goal.
The rocketry was not the most complicated bit. What was complicated were the things like guidance, being able to get two crafts in space to dock with each other, the ability to develop a lander that could not just land on the moon, but more important, get off the moon.
With the likelihood of reaching the moon rapidly diminishing, skeptical journalist Marcus Allen believes that elsewhere a very different mission was being planned. one to fake the moon landings.
At some point, it may well have dawned on somebody really involved in it at the top level. This is a very risky business, to land men live on television, don't forget, live on television, on the moon, where we've never done it before. So why don't we have a plan B?
Whether or not there really was a plan B, NASA prepared for the first test launch of their moonship, Apollo 1, at breakneck pace. But many people on the team, chief among them lead astronaut Gus Grissom, felt the program was being pushed through too quickly. Safety was being sacrificed for speed.
Gus Grissom was the most beloved of all of the astronauts, and he was endeared to the public, so he was going to be the first man to walk on the moon. But he was also the most critical of all of the astronauts and the most outspoken. And he prepared report after report to give to NASA, to give to the Flight Center, to give to members of Congress to say that this program is falling apart.
Worried NASA was ignoring his concerns. Grissom and his crew broke ranks, taking a spoof picture of themselves praying over a model of their space capsule. That joke had a tragic punchline. On January the 27th, during a final systems test before the launch, Grissom and his colleagues, Edward White and Roger Chaffee, died in a horrific incident.
The atmosphere in this craft was a very high percentage of oxygen. And of course, when you have a high percentage of oxygen in a craft, even the slightest spark turns into a gigantic fire immediately. Something happened. It's not clear quite what, probably loose wires, a spark. And the astronauts, before anything can be done, are all just incinerated.
Bart Sibrel, for one, believes it was no accident that such an outspoken critic of the program was killed in the fire.
Now they knew if they asked this guy to fake the moon landing when he was such a complainer, you know, he probably is not going to cooperate and he might call the media. In fact, days before he burned alive, without permission, he had an impromptu press conference.
Grissom hung a lemon, American slang for a broken down piece of junk, on the command module simulator to show the world just how worried he was.
So you can imagine the general at the Pentagon eating his supper and seeing this, and they're like, we have to get rid of this guy. So apparently they burned 2 other people along with him to make it look like they weren't singling him out.
Whatever its cause, the Apollo 1 fire was a national disaster. America's space program was suspended.
It was one of these shocks, that just a kick in the gut, that not just 3 men dying in a particularly gruesome way, but the project dead in its tracks.
Despite this horrendous setback, by July 1969, just 2.5 years later, Neil Armstrong was making history, live on television. It seemed almost too good to be true. Bart Sibrel says there's a reason for that.
Tranquility Base here.
It wasn't true at all.
The Eagle has landed.
What's easier to do today? To make a movie about going to Mars or to actually go to Mars? It's, of course, easier to make a movie about it.
Okay, I'm looking good there, Neil.
It was probably done at a military base known as Area 51. At least the television pictures were shot in a circular studio about the size of a fuel tank at an airport. And that way they could do a very convincing panoramic 360.
Conspiracists point to the lack of independent witnesses as further proof of their theory.
Between takeoff and splashdown, we rely on one source of information, NASA.
You have a TV picture. I mean, people say, well, I was there. Really? You were there? We saw a fuzzy black and white TV picture, and somehow people assumed, yeah, that's the truth.
Bart Sibrel doesn't dispute that Armstrong and the others did actually make it into space. But he claims they only went up a few hundred miles into Earth orbit. According to him, they never even got close to making the 250,000-mile trip to the moon. And he says that 30 years after the landings, he unearthed a damning piece of evidence that proves the conspiracy is true.
It says, real big on the screen, do not show to the public. Hit play from the top. And the first thing we hear is NASA saying that the TV picture looks great.
According to NASA, these pictures were taken when Apollo 11 was more than 100,000 miles from Earth. At that distance, there is a long delay in communication because radio waves must cross the vast expanse between the capsule and mission control.
There's exactly 4 seconds of dead air. Then we hear a third party that's not NASA and not Neil Armstrong say, talk. And then Neil Armstrong starts speaking. So apparently he had a secret earpiece in, and someone from the CIA or whoever was counting off on a stopwatch. So NASA asked a question, they counted off exactly 4 seconds, and then we heard talk. And then he starts speaking.
In other words, Sibrel believes NASA faked a 4-second radio delay to make it seem like Armstrong was halfway to the moon. It's an astonishing claim. But Sibrel, and many like him, say there is even more proof right there in the iconic images of the mission.
I started looking at the pictures, and I started questioning them, because he's in shadow. Why is there so much light?
The alleged scenes on the moon were in fact shot with electrical light rather than sunlight. That's what I noticed.
Marcus Allen sees another problem in the beautiful images captured by the astronauts.
The Hasselblad camera being used on the moon did not have a viewfinder because they took the mirror out. You had to focus it yourself, you had to set the aperture yourself, you had to set the shutter speed yourself, while wearing armored gauntlets through which you couldn't actually feel anything. So with all those restrictions on your movement and your operation of the camera, some of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century were produced. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it.
What's more, many people claim that the live television pictures of the American flag waving back and forth also prove the landings were shot in a television studio.
It looks to me that there's wind. Now, of course, there's no atmosphere on the moon, and I figured that they probably got really hot in there to compensate for that. They probably just put in a ton of air conditioning, and that occasionally made the flag blow.
Roll 1, slate 2, take 5.
Sibrel is absolutely convinced the astronauts lied to the world. In fact, he's so certain he went on a personal mission to make them confess their guilt.
If you walked on the moon, we're given the opportunity to swear to God that you walked on the moon.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to get the hell knocked out of you if you don't leave me alone.
And put your hand on the Bible, swear to God you walked on the moon.
Mr. Sibrel, knowing you, that's probably a fake Bible.
Get the hell out of my house. You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself. Away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
If I walked on the moon, I would find it so hysterically funny that someone thought otherwise. If someone came up to me and I really walked on the moon and they said, swear in a Bible, I say, sure, I swear in a Bible. Do you want me to swear in 3 Bibles or house 10? But they reacted the exact opposite.
The arguments that the moon landings were a massive conspiracy have persuaded many, many people over the years. But how credible are they? Professor of Science and Media Chris Riley has been studying the moon landings for a decade. He believes the conspiracy theorists are living in fantasy.
Any sane person that studies the science behind the conspiracy theories can conclude for themselves that there is absolutely no doubt that 12 human beings walked on the moon. And that's in part backed up by the fact that 400,000 Americans worked on that program for the best part of 10 years. That's 4 million human years of effort to achieve that goal. And with that kind of ambition and aim, anything is possible, really.
Riley says the so-called evidence that conspiracists rely on is wrong. Simple physics can explain the anomalies they see in images from the missions.
The flapping flag point is really a gross misunderstanding of how things behave in a vacuum. Now, as soon as you've got something hanging in a vacuum and you're twisting the pole that the flag is hanging off, you're going to set the flag swinging. And when you set something swinging in a vacuum, when you let go of it, it will carry on swinging because there's no air to slow it down. It looks somewhat otherworldly, and that's because it is otherworldly.
He can also explain why the astronauts were able to take such amazing pictures, despite wearing thick spacesuit gloves, and why they appear to be lit by multiple light sources.
There are two answers to that point. The first one is that they trained a hell of a lot, nothing was left to chance. And number two, they took an awful lot of pictures. And actually, there's plenty of websites now that have published all the photos. And if you look through them, you see that some of them were pretty bad. They're out of focus, they're blurred, they weren't framing each other right. And it's only the best ones that we tend to see. You've also got to remember on the moon that it's a relatively reflective body. You only need to look up at it at night when it's a full moon to sort of see how bright it is. Because there's no atmosphere, light bounces around on the surface there in ways that are very different to how it behaves on Earth.
Right out the window.
Still, for Sibrel, Alan, and so many others like them, nothing anyone says will sway their opinion. They firmly believe we never went to the moon.
I'm just looking for the truth. After I said, oh my God, 100 times, I cried. Because it's so sad, the world that we live in, that mankind would do such a deplorable, despicable thing. But we live in a world where people kill millions of people, and people who know we live in a world like that don't think they might lie about a scientific accomplishment. That's foolhardy.
I have a copy of a tabloid magazine which says Elvis shot Kennedy. And I think actually that's more likely than the possibility that the Americans never went to the moon. There's far too many people involved in this process. And to get all of those people to remain loyal to the lie for all those years would have been impossible.
Whether it was real rocket science or clever conspiracy, the Americans had undoubtedly become top dog in space.
The United States definitely wins the race that Kennedy set. They get to the moon first. The Soviets never get to the moon.
But why didn't the Soviets get to the moon? Before 1969, they were beating America hands down. They had the first satellite, the first man and first woman in space. They had the first spacewalk too. So what went wrong? Many say the Soviet space program was not nearly as advanced as it led the world to believe. Some even claim there was a decades-long cover-up of exploding rockets, failed missions, and dead cosmonauts.
We knew it was another failed journey into space.
The 3rd of July, 1969. A massive ship stands ready for launch. But this isn't an American moon rocket. It's the Soviet rival, an even more powerful machine called the N-1.
The N-1 rocket was the Soviet answer to NASA's Saturn V rocket. So this was an enormous, heavy-lift vehicle of comparable size, something over 350 feet tall when sort of fully stacked.
This was supposed to be the craft that took Russian cosmonauts to the moon. There was just one problem. It couldn't fly. The program never got further than these disastrous unmanned tests.
In the 4 tests out of 12 that were planned, they all died in mid-air before the first stage had completed.
The failure of the N-1 ended the huge Soviet moon program. But incredibly, the Russians managed to keep it a complete secret. These pictures of the disaster didn't become public until 1989, 20 years after they happened.
A lot of the Russian space race and their own moon program was developed without the eyes of the world looking. When things went wrong, it didn't always leak out until decades later.
In fact, Russia lied to the world. After they lost the race to the moon, they pretended they never wanted to go there in the first place.
The Russians pretty much sort of threw in the towel then, and they then repurposed their program, claiming that they'd always just intended to place large payloads into Earth orbit with the purpose of building space stations.
This Soviet policy of secrecy and disinformation has caused many to wonder what else they were lying about.
That sort of cover-up set the tone that people began to suspect that Moscow would say anything and lie about anything if it came to protecting their reputation of their space program.
Some even claim that Yuri Gagarin was not the first person in space. They believe that the Soviets also covered up other disasters, accidents that left cosmonauts dead in orbit, or worse, drifting off into space with no way back.
I think launches that occurred that we didn't hear about because they were not successful, these stories have never been either totally refuted or totally confirmed. And that is where this whole mystery comes from.
Ecco qui, mentre siamo all'ascolto.
Another firm subscriber to this theory is Giovanni Judica Cordilia, an amateur radio enthusiast from Turin, Italy.
On the 4th of October 1957, there was the Sputnik first launch, and we decided to see if we could connect ourselves. It was on an easy frequency, and we managed to hear it.
After listening in to Sputnik, Giovanni and his older brother, Achille, became obsessed with the space race. So obsessed, they set up their own private listening post so they could eavesdrop on these missions. In the years that followed, Giovanni claims they uncovered at least 3 manned Soviet launches before Gagarin's that all ended in tragedy. One of them occurred in February 1961.
The evening of the 2nd of February, at 10 in the evening, we recorded some frequencies used by the Soviets. We heard difficult breathing.
This is the recording the brothers claim to have made that night.
We were very shocked when we listened to such dramatic breathing. My brother was a medical student at the time, and we contacted one of his professors. When he listened to the recording, he diagnosed a person starved of oxygen. This made us think that inside the vehicle, the air supply was cut off.
Could this have been a secret space mission gone wrong? All that is certain is that Moscow made no announcement of a manned launch that day. When the Italian press learned about their recordings, the brothers became famous in their own country. Spurred on by the media, they expanded their operation. Over the years, they begged, borrowed, and bought so much equipment they were able to create their own private mission control. In October 1963, they used this enhanced setup to record what they claim is an even more disturbing secret Soviet mission.
All of a sudden, we heard a woman's voice, a dramatic piece that made us think of an imminent end.
With the help of their sister, a Russian language student, Giovanni and Achille made a rough translation of this recording.
Her voice, what she was saying, was very dramatic. At one point, she started talking about flames. I see a flame, I see a flame. Her voice was very agitated, worried. And then she asked, "Will I get back?" Then the communication stopped, and the two of us were left without words. The classic swish came back, the typical sound of the short waves, and then nothing. Silence.
Could these recordings be an elaborate hoax? The Soviet track record of lies and cover-ups make many people think they can't be fake.
Why would they bother to make it all up? I don't think they did. If what they recorded recounts Russian cosmonauts, both male and female, who appear to be unable to return to Earth, that is quite shocking. Now, would the Soviet Union, as they were at the time, announce that? Probably not.
Former NASA mission controller and amateur historian James Oberg has uncovered evidence that shows just how far Russians sometimes went to conceal their failures. Duplicate versions of photographs showing the cosmonauts. Except, in certain versions, some of the cosmonauts are missing.
Photographs in which, in a group, 4 men in the back row in one group and only 3 in the other. And in place of the 4th man, a shadow. Maybe his hand still on his neighbor's shoulder, but he's clearly been removed from the photograph.
This was a popular technique from the earliest days of the Soviet Union. People who might be an embarrassment were simply erased from history. So who were these people deleted from the official records? Could they be the ones recorded by the Yudica Cordelia brothers?
After finding several before and after pairs like this, we began to wonder if these men had been among those secretly killed early in the program.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the country's secret space archives were opened. Using some contacts he made while at NASA, James Oberg went to Moscow to investigate the doctored cosmonaut photos.
It was funny to the degree that the Soviet censors would release the forged version, forgetting or not caring that the authentic version had already been released. Or someone else would release the authentic version a year or 2 after the forged version was in another magazine. They just couldn't control all the lies they were telling.
After years of research, Oberg learned the fates of these missing cosmonauts. And it wasn't what he'd been expecting. One of them was 27-year-old Grigory Nilyubov.
Grigory Nilyubov had been one of the finalists for Gagarin's flight, but he was involved in a shameful disciplinary issue.
Nilyubov's crime was being drunk and disorderly on the Moscow metro with 2 fellow cosmonauts. A minor offense for an ordinary citizen, but cosmonauts were great communist heroes. And heroes don't get into brawls at train stations.
All three got reported, cashiered, and exiled from the Cosmonaut program. Gone forever, and not just from the program, from the group photographs too.
Lyubov died in 1966, but it was here on Earth by suicide. And it turns out that none of the other airbrushed men had died in secret space flights either.
People were being taken out of the pictures who hadn't passed the test, who had dropped out, who had made their colleagues ashamed of them or embarrassed by them, and they were gone.
What's more, Oberg cannot find a single launch that matches up with the Judica Cordelia recordings.
There are no secret graves. There are no people missing. We now know what happened to all of them, and there aren't anybody there on that list that appears to have gone off somewhere and was lost in space.
Nonetheless, Achille Judica Cordelia went to his grave insisting he had captured real space disasters. His brother Giovanni still insists on it today.
Those people who doubt us are the ones who never contacted us. They never saw our equipment, and they have never experienced our way of working.
But whether the tapes are real or a hoax, it's now known that the Soviet space program was never as advanced as they claimed.
The cosmonaut program was really, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors in a way, because what they do is they use basically the same technology. It doesn't change at all. They have capsules at the top. They put different things or people in the capsules and make it look like they're breaking boundaries.
In the end, this strategy backfired. By pretending to be pioneers, the Soviets simply spurred their American rivals on to even greater success. But for many, the question still remains: how did NASA manage to develop such sophisticated technology in such a short space of time? One conspiracist thinks they had help, and that the help was out of this world.
My take on the whole moon landing is that we went there with advanced help from extraterrestrial groups and with their technology.
Many people believe the USA never made it to the moon. They say the real mission was a conspiracy to fake the lunar landings. But there is another conspiracy out there. David Griffin campaigns to reveal government secrets about UFOs. He thinks that America definitely went to the moon, and it got there with help from alien civilizations. He also thinks that NASA used this technology to send a secret manned mission to Mars decades ago.
There's a whole group of people that claim to have been part of the military that claim that there's been a base on Mars for the last 20 years and that we have the technology at Mars. There's people can go and stay there for years on end.
Griffin says proof of his extreme-sounding theory was discovered by British computer hacker Gary McKinnon. In March 2002, McKinnon was arrested in London on the orders of the US government. He'd hacked into the Pentagon and was facing up to 70 years in an American jail, possibly even in Guantanamo Bay.
And this is hugely embarrassing to the USA, so they had to make sort of an example of him to prevent anyone else thinking they were going to do that.
But why would the US demand such a harsh punishment for an autistic bedroom hacker? Griffin says there can only be one reason. McKinnon had discovered an alien-powered American space fleet patrolling the solar system.
I think some of it was a panic reaction that is like, oh my God, someone's pierced the veil and has actually pulled out these sort of documents.
McKinnon no longer talks about his hacking exploits. But in 2008, while his lawyers battled to prevent his extradition to America, he explained why he did it and what he was looking for. An alien technology called free energy, which he claimed could provide unlimited power for the entire planet.
Rogue elements of military and intelligence had captured and reverse engineered some of the technology, and they had a free energy technology. And, you know, in these days of oil crisis and stuff, I found that hugely interesting and thought at the time it was morally correct to break the law in order to get the technology out to the public.
He was disgusted that pensioners were dying from the cold and were being forced to make this decision between eating and heating. And that was his driving interest, was to perhaps think, well, in that case, these elderly people needn't die because they could be switching on something that wouldn't be costing the earth to switch on. In fact, it could be free. He found, to his astonishment, even in the early days, that when he got through to NASA or Jet Propulsion Laboratories, that was supposed to be the height of security, height of defense, he found that they were left on Windows default settings, so he managed to get through into all these computer networks.
But the secret of free energy technology wasn't the only thing McKinnon says he found in these classified computer systems.
The wonderful thing he then found was a file that had a whole list of what they termed as non-terrestrial officers. Non-terrestrial officers most probably means officers that go and operate this advanced machinery that we know for certain we have ever since the Roswell crash in 1947.
McKinnon also claims to have seen a picture of an alien spacecraft.
It was a very exotic craft. I only saw about 2/3 of the picture. It had no sort of seams or rivets. It didn't look man-made at all.
That was certainly enough, along with many other things, to perhaps put forward the idea that we certainly do have our own secret space fleet, but one that's been hidden and kept sort of quiet from the majority of the civilization.
For a decade, his family and friends, David Griffin among them, fought to keep McKinnon out of American hands. Finally, in 2012, Home Secretary Theresa May blocked his extradition, and he walked out of court a free man.
Absolutely incredible. I mean, it's the biggest relief ever, and it is a culmination of everyone working together.
McKinnon may be free in his home country, but the USA has never dropped the charges against him. If he ever goes abroad, he could be snatched again and sent to America in handcuffs. Could this be, as David Griffin believes, because McKinnon really did uncover evidence of a secret space fleet powered by free energy? Professor of Science and Media Chris Riley finds this hard to believe.
Every year, NASA has to fight for their budget, and one of their great ambitions is this search for evidence of intelligent technological life. If they knew of any kind of evidence for this, they would be singing it from the rooftops, because their future budgets would depend on the success of those discoveries. The fact that anyone can imagine that such things are known by any agency or government on Earth and not disclosed is frankly bonkers.
Still, whatever skeptics say, people continue to believe there is a secret world of cover-ups dating back to the very dawn of the space age.
These conspiracy theories will always exist. They have existed throughout history. But I think the other reason why perhaps a conspiracy theory takes root is because space is otherworldly. It's the perfect scenario for carrying out something secret because you limit the number of witnesses. You know, it's not just a case of going to a place in the Arizona desert. You can carry it off because it's out there.
In the world of conspiracy theories, space remains the final frontier.